Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. As Daryl mentioned, my name is Trevor Watson. I am the VP of Business Development at LHPH Capital. And this afternoon, I'm going to be talking real high level about lease-here, pay-here, and used car leasing as a competitive advantage in today's world. Yes? A little bit. Is that a little better? Perfect. All right. Thank you. Okay, so real quick background on LHPH Capital, just so you can understand where we're coming from. LHPH Capital is a boutique lender. We provide lines of credit to both independent and franchise dealers all across the country that have their own used car leasing programs. LHPH started in 2009. It was actually started as a consulting firm by both Terry Bowler and George Klinke, each of whom had 40 years worth of consumer leasing experience. And they started it back in the recession, helping dealers learn how to do used car leasing. And then 2012, they bumped into Don Foss. You guys are probably familiar with Don, started CAC. And Don had a new project that he was working on back then, and he was starting the CarRight dealer group. And one of the things that he wanted to do with CarRight was he wanted it to have its own captive used car leasing company. And so he got with George and Terry, and they created Bright Leasing, which became the captive used car leasing program for the CarRight dealerships. LHPH was the lessor on the first $300 million that Don Foss put out on the road in used car leases until CAC called up Don and said, hey, you're becoming a competitive threat to us, you need to stop it. And Don was on the board, so he had to stop it, and he did. So at that point, Terry and George kind of went back to the drawing board, and a year or two later, we actually decided to do a pivot and become a capital provider. So in 2016, 2017, Terry thought that the thing that used car dealers really needed was a lender that was dedicated to their specific market. And we came out, we've been doing lines of credit now for 6-7 years. So obviously we've seen a whole lot of different business models. We've seen a whole lot of different dealerships be successful in used car leasing. One of the cool things about leasing, and we'll talk about it here in a bit, is how flexible the lease contract can be, which means that everybody's program is different. Everyone's is designed for their market, for their dealership. So what I'm going to do here is really show you a 30,000 foot level, right? If you decide you're going to get into used car leasing, you're likely to create your own niche and to really customize it to your dealership. But this is the high level reason why you would want to do the value proposition of used car leasing. So to kick it off, I'm actually going to start with the language of leasing. This was a slide that George Klinke made for me when I first started at LHPH, and that's because my background is 20 plus years of auto finance, almost exclusively using retail installment sales contracts. So when I came on board and he's telling me, the agreed upon value, and I'm looking at him like he's speaking a different language, I had no idea. I put $7 billion of risk contracts on the road, and I have no idea what you're talking about. And what it really boils down to is it's not that difficult, but sometimes it sounds like it, right? But here's the comparison of these different terms. So if you hear me say agreed upon value, all I'm saying is the retail sales price. If you hear me say cap cost reduction, that is the down payment. If I talk about the residual value, if you imagine a balloon note, a balloon installment note where the customer makes all the small payments and there's a balloon at the end, that's what the residual value is. And if I say the lessee, that's going to be your driver. The lessor, that is the owner of the contract. And in leasing, that is going to be, at least in used car leasing, the dealership or the leasing company. You own that actual title, you own that vehicle, and the customer is just driving it. And then down here at the bottom, money factor, the equivalent would be the interest rate, but we'll talk a little bit more about it later. There is not an interest rate in a lease. There's a money factor or a rent factor, but not an interest rate. And that comes into play when we start talking about usury rates and usury caps. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so very high level. Why LHPH? Why would you do leasing? Now I'm going to dive into each one of these in a little more specific here in a minute. So I'm going to just touch on them first. The number one reason is that sales tax advantage. I think Bob talked about it earlier in his presentation. That's the number one reason why most dealers get into leasing. It's applicable in 31 states, and I'll show you some examples of that in a bit. The second one is affordability. Why do people lease new cars? So they can get a smaller payment on a shorter term. Why do people lease used cars? So they can get a smaller payment on a shorter term. There you go. And what that translates into is a competitive advantage. So that affordability piece, if you and the dealer next to you are both selling a very similar car and your payment is $100 less per month than your neighbor's, there's your competitive advantage. But it gets a little bit deeper, and we'll touch on that in a minute. Next up is profitability. Leasing is highly profitable. There are a number of fees in a lease that are not in a retail installment sales contract. So there's that component of it. You also get, and I'll show you some examples here in a little bit, that affordability piece plays into a competitive advantage as well, right? The number one predictor of loss on an auto portfolio, at least frequency of loss, is going to be payment to income. So if you can shrink the payment to income, then you will, over time, typically see a better performance. Next benefit, that could probably even go to number one, is the federal income tax benefit. So when you are a lessor and you own all these vehicles in your fleet, you actually put them on as an asset and then you depreciate them on your financial statements, which means that you generate tons of depreciation that you can use to offset your net income. So most dealers that have a used car leasing program pay minimal, if any, federal income tax. Most of them have NOL carry forwards. There's also currently something called bonus depreciation, which starts to wind down, but right now you can take 100% of the entire value of that vehicle year one and put it on the road, which is incredible. Next year it goes to 8%. You heard Bob mention something about that in his presentation as well, but that's a huge benefit. And then a few more benefits here. Bankruptcy remote. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with the fact that a lease cannot go into a BK. So you do not have all the same headaches that you get with a retail installment sales contract. With a lease, there's only two options for the lessee. I'll talk about it in a bit. Collateral control, I've said it a couple times, but when you are the lessor, you own that vehicle. There's a reason why rent to own is very popular in Louisiana, and that's because they don't have to follow all the same rules when it comes to repossessions that you have to follow with a retail installment sales contract. And that's because you are the owner of that vehicle as opposed to the registered owner on a retail installment sales contract. Customer retention, because you own that vehicle, every vehicle is coming back to you at some point. So when they get to the end of that lease, whether it's a 24-month lease, 30, 36, whatever, that customer has to bring that vehicle back to you. And you're going to get another opportunity to put them into another vehicle, something you don't necessarily get with a retail installment sales contract. You hope that customer comes back to you because they liked your program, they like your dealership, but with a lease, they're guaranteed to come back. Residual cash flow, this really stems from the fact that there's a residual value in every single one of your contracts. So when your portfolio matures, meaning if your average term was 36 months, when your portfolio has reached that point and now you have lease returns coming back every single month, each one of those vehicles has value. And you can either lease them out again, you can wholesale them, you can sell them to the customer for the residual value, you can retail them. Whatever you do with all those lease returns, you get a huge uptick in residual cash flow at that point. And lastly, this is kind of a catch-all, but flexibility of leasing. The lease contract, by its very nature, is very flexible, right? You can actually customize it. You can have your attorney or you can have Hudson Cook actually customize your lease contract, and you can build in all kinds of cool things, all kinds of unique features to your own program. You can even build in products, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Back in 2018, 2019, I'm sure everyone heard the word subscription program, because that was the big buzzword back then. A subscription program is simply a lease that you build with additional products into. That is all it is. You put a service contract and some insurance into it, and you got yourself a subscription program. But it's just a lease contract. So leases are inherently flexible, and that is a huge value add if you're doing used car leasing. So now I'm going to dive into some of these a little bit closer, starting off with the number one reason why almost any LHPH dealer, if you talk to them, why they got into leasing, and that is the sales tax or cash flow advantage. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with how sales tax works on a retail installment sales contract in almost every state except for Texas. But typically you pay sales tax on the entire sales price up front at the time of the sale. With leasing, at least in 31 states, you get what's called pay-as-you-go sales tax. And with pay-as-you-go sales tax, you only pay sales tax on the monies that you receive. So if the customer gives you a $1,000 down payment and you have a 7% sales tax rate, you're going to cut a check to the state for $70, and you're done. And then the customer, on every payment they make, whether it's monthly, bi-weekly, weekly, whatever, they include their own sales tax in each one of those payments. You take that, you turn around, and you just ship it off to the state. And that has an enormous impact when it comes to cash flow. I'm going to show you an example here in a second. If you're wondering, Arizona does indeed have pay-as-you-go sales tax, as do pretty much all the states in the Southwest have pay-as-you-go sales tax, which is awesome. But if you don't have pay-as-you-go sales tax, don't worry. If you're from a state that's not in the Southwest, come talk. There actually, as I mentioned, you can customize a lease contract. You can customize a lease contract to get yourself pay-as-you-go sales tax in a number of states. So, kind of cool. So what does this actually look like? I know this is going to be small for a lot of you guys, so I'll try to talk my way through here. On the left-hand side, we have a dealership that does retail installment sales contracts. Their average sales price is going to be $17,999. They're getting $1,200 down on every car. Their sales tax rate, which is the sales tax rate if you're in Phoenix, it's going to be Maricopa plus AZ plus City of Phoenix, 8.3%. And this dealership is selling 20 cars per month. On the right-hand side under lease, exact same dealer doing leasing, exact same averages, and selling 20 leases per month. The dealer with the retail installment sales contracts is going to pay each month $29,000, almost $30,000 in sales tax. The dealer that's doing leasing is going to pay just slightly less than $2,000 a month in sales tax. Dive into that a little bit more. Both of them are getting $24,000 a month in down payments, right? 20 units a month at $1,200 down payment on each. So both of them get $24,000. What that means to the gentleman on the left doing the retail installment sales contracts is they actually have to dig into their own pocket, find almost $6,000 of their own money, and cut a check to the state for that. For the folks doing leasing, they got that $24,000, they cut their $2,000 check to the state, and they get to pocket the other $22,008. That's a fairly impressive swing between the $6,000 to the $22,000. It's the exact same numbers there. That swing, that positive cash flow swing, is $27,000, almost $28,000 a month for that dealership, which translates into $334,000 a year in positive cash flow for that dealer selling 20 cars a month. That's the reason why it's the number one reason why dealers get into lease-here, pay-here. Depending on what state you're in also, you avoid losing the sales tax on your defaults. If you're in a state where they do not give you some sort of credit, some sort of pro rata on the down payment on an early default, then you can lose a lot of money on a subprime customer who defaults after 2 months you paid their sales tax for. With leasing, that'll never happen if you're in a pay-as-you-go sales tax state. Okay, so next, and actually this is awesome because the guy did a great job of pretty much saying everything that I'm about to say here, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I'm sure you guys have all seen this graph that comes out like every 2 or 3 weeks these days. And that's the price of used cars and how it skyrocketed back in 2021, and now it is coming back down, which is awesome. But I'm gonna say, while it's coming back down, I don't think we're ever gonna see it come back down to pre-pandemic levels. And here's the reasons why. One, you gotta have new cars to have used cars, right? And I think Guy mentioned it as well, but basically, the manufacturers are saying they're not going to get back to full production until 2023, which means they're putting out new cars in 2024. Those new cars have to become used cars 2025. Maybe we get some relief on that piece. Right now, the SAR for this year, I think it just bumped up, but we're at 13 million for the year is what we're pacing. I think it's bumped to 13.5, but we are a far cry from the 17 million that we used to run at prior to the recession. I'm sorry, prior to COVID. So my argument would be we're never going to see 2019 prices again, and there's my logic, and it's just that trend line starting back in 2008 and going all the way to 2019. They've never come back down. Used car prices have never come back down. Sure, they come back down for like 3 or 4 months in that graph, but in the end, they never come back down. And then to emphasize the point, when we had when COVID first hit, and the world was ending and car prices collapsed, and oh my God. Well, take a look at those 2 red arrows. The one red arrow on this side is when COVID hit. Car prices dropped to 2018 levels during that whole fiasco. So how anyone's going to convince me that we're going to get prices that are going to go lower than that without some similar scenario, I just don't see it. But beyond that, from the consumer's perspective, when we're talking about affordability and the challenges, as was already talked about earlier, inflation has actually eaten away all those gains that they made in their wages, right? So at this point, the buying power for a consumer is actually less than what it was in 2021. And we know that this is having an impact on consumers because we're seeing the delinquency rates in all the ABS deals spiking. They just pop back up to 2019 levels. And they did that over the course of like 3 months. So I guarantee you that is not where they're gonna level off, that's just the beginning. And of course, first comes delinquency, then comes charge off, then comes bankruptcy. And we know that inflation is still running strong at 8.2%, and that's gonna translate into additional rate hikes, and those rate hikes are gonna stick around. And all of this is really to say that it's really tough out there for our customers right now. It's a real challenge, and it's not likely to get any better anytime soon. And that affordability challenge will remain. So, let's talk about the benefit, the affordability benefit with leasing. On the left-hand side again, I've got our risk contract, a retail installment sales contract. It's the exact same deal before, $1,799. I dropped a service contract into this one at $1,500. Down payment, $1,200. And I set the term at 42 months. And I remember there was a time, once upon a time, where, like, oh my God, you're gonna go 42 months on a subprime customer? That's crazy. Well, at 42 months on this particular deal, at $2,599, that customer's payment is $716 a month. That's huge. If they're making $2,500 a month, that's just unrealistic, I think. But it's today's world, right? Let's make that exact same deal, we're gonna turn it into a lease. Remember when I said agreed upon value? That's your retail sales price. We've got our cap cost reduction down there at $1,200, that's our down payment. Money factor, 0.01. That's the exact same money factor as the $2,599 in the lease. There's another little benefit of leasing. Your customer looks at 0.01 on the contract instead of 25.99% in the TILA box. Just one less objection. We've got a residual value in there, and this is kind of cut off down here, but if I set the term at the exact same number at 42 months, the customer's payment is $582 a month. So apples to apples, that customer is going to make a $582 per month payment instead of $716, $140 less per month. Now, we all know that when it comes to subprime lending, the goal is to keep your term as short as possible, right? The shorter you keep it, the less likely there is an opportunity for a life event for one of these customers. So if that customer can truly afford a $700 a month payment, maybe they've got the income to support it, maybe they've paid similar payments in the past. If that's the case, then I'm just gonna cut my term. I'm gonna go back to 30 months. At 30 months, I know you can't see it, that payment is $697 a month, including sales tax for that customer. So if they can't afford $700 a month, I'm in that customer for 30 months instead of 42. So if that makes some sense there. Now some folks will say, well, that's okay, I'm just gonna stretch out the term on my retail installment sales contract, and I'll go 60 months, and I can get to a $580 payment at 60 months. Well, I mean, if you really wanna be married to a subprime customer for 5 years, then I guess more power to you. But instead, I would suggest maybe you consider a lease agreement. I still wouldn't go 60 months on a lease, but if you did, that customer's payment is $496 a month. But if you go back to a 48-month term, that customer's payment is $546. So now I'm back to a 4-year term instead of 5, and I'm still $40 less than that retail installment sales contract. That's the affordability benefit of leasing. So, as I mentioned earlier, affordability becomes your competitive advantage, right? There's a great quote from Jack Welch that says, if you don't have a competitive advantage, don't compete. If you're doing the exact same thing that everybody else is doing, maybe you should look at some way to differentiate yourself. If you're using a lease contract, then the simplest and most straightforward competitive advantage is the fact that you're going to be between $100 and $150 less per month on the exact same car, apples to apples, every time. However, you can actually take the affordability benefit and leverage it and kind of take it to another level. And here's my example for that. Let's imagine that this is one of your competitors down the road. They're selling this 2011 Cadillac. It's got 91,000 miles on it. I know you cannot see that from where you're sitting, but just trust me. And they're selling it for $13,800, right? That's their sales price. And maybe you have this 2017 Toyota Corolla with 58,000 miles on it, and you're selling it for just shy of $17,000, $16,990, okay? We're gonna put the Cadillac on a retail installment sales contract, and we're gonna set the Toyota on a lease. We're gonna put both of them at 48 months, both of them at $25,999, both of them with a $1,200 down payment, and both of them I'm gonna put a $1,500 service contract on. The Cadillac, with 91,000 miles, is gonna have a payment of $514 per month, probably broken down into bi-weekly, but there's your monthly. And the lease on the 2017 Corolla with 58,000 miles is gonna be at $516 per month. The exact same payment for the customer on a vehicle that is 6 years, 5 years newer, and half the mileage. So I guess I would ask then at that point, which one would your customer prefer? Now you may have a customer who's like, I want the Cadillac. I would say, awesome, let's put it on a lease and let's go 24 months and I'll give you the same payment. But odds are your customer may actually want the vehicle that's still underneath the manufacturer's warranty for the same payment. That's kind of cool. And then beyond that, next question, which one is more likely to, as we say, tote the note? Which one of those two cars is actually gonna make it the full 4 years, pretty much guaranteed? And I would say the Toyota has a much better chance than the Cadillac does. And on top of that, which one's gonna have less cost to you as the dealership to maintain when it has issues, needs repairs? Odds are the Toyota again. So that's where you can take that affordability benefit and actually turn it into the next level, which is you can actually do a newer vehicle, lower mileage, and have the same payment for your customer. All right, so now moving into the profitability piece here. We just talked about it, newer, lower mile vehicles. With leasing, one of the key things, right, this is your asset. The more times you can turn that vehicle through a full-term lease, I'm not talking about churning and having repossessions, but they're still gonna happen, don't get me wrong, but the goal is to have as many full-term leases as we can get. And the more times I can spin a vehicle through full-term leases, my return on investment and my return on asset go through the roof. So the goal is to keep them going as long as you can, right? So the less repairs you have over the life of the asset, obviously less cost to you, and lower losses due to mechanical if you have a vehicle that starts off with less issues. The additional fee opportunities, I already spoke to that. There are a number of fees. There's probably 8 or 9 fees that you can include into a lease that a retail installment sales contract simply can't have. And higher returns on the money factor. Now this one, I don't want anyone to get crazy about this one, but usury does not apply to a money factor, okay? So the usury rate does not apply to a money factor. You can go as high as you want to on it. I would not recommend getting egregious by any means because that is the word that they use with leasing. That if the APR, or if the interest rate implicit in the lease is egregious. However, you can absolutely use that affordability benefit to bump up your interest rate implicit in the lease. If your interest rate implicit in the lease is not enough to cover your losses, right, when you're looking at your static loss curve, then you should bump it up. You should cover your actual losses on your financing with your interest rate implicit in the lease. And if you're in a state like Arkansas where your usury rate is 16%, you can absolutely go to 21% on a lease and have no exposure. So that's huge. Another way that dealers maximize this is you can actually build products into your lease. So for instance, if you want to put a service contract in every single one of your leases, and maybe you want to put loss damage waiver, and maybe you want to put roadside assistance in because you really don't like those phone calls you get on Saturday where somebody needs you to come out and jump their car, you can build all of those into your lease contract. You do have to disclose them. You put a 0 for the cost, and then you build them into your rent factor, into your money factor, such that they're paid for through the money factor. As part of your program. So even if that pushes your interest rate implicit in the lease above the usury rate, it has been challenged multiple times with some of our dealerships, and they won each and every time because they are providing a value that a retail installment sales contract cannot provide without the customer purchasing it. Okay. Moving to the next one, I mentioned earlier that impact on the performance of your portfolio. This is a dealer that came on board with us in 2019. And they were doing buy here, pay here, and they switched to leasing. This particular static pool is gross. So in case you're looking at it, you're going, man, that's really high. This is a gross static loss instead of a net. And the reason for that is that it's hard to get recovery numbers on a lease out of today's DMS systems. So we typically use a gross number. And tomorrow when I talk about static pools, that might make a little bit more sense. But what you can see is that there was a huge impact. Now I'm gonna be very transparent here though. That's not all from leasing. 2020, there was so much stimulus funds that were pumped into the economy that also had a huge impact there as well. But we do see this trend where losses come down with many of the dealers that we transition from buy here, pay here to lease here, pay here. And odds are it's because of the reduced payment to income, smaller payment, and shorter term. Spoke to those right there. Next benefit, we saw this play out over the last year and a half as inventory got really tight. When you build your own leasing portfolio, it generates inventory for you that comes back around, right? Those lease returns that come back around when your portfolio matures. I have no idea what this world's gonna look like in 3 years from now, but I know that if you have a lease portfolio and your average term is 36 months, you will have inventory coming back, you will have lease returns. And that has helped out a lot of our dealers through the last 12 months because they weren't able to find inventory as easily as they were previously. They had lease returns that were coming back in every month, and that's what they used to work off of for the last 12 months. Okay, and then this one, I just have to throw this one in because it's a reality, right? EVs are coming, whether you like them or don't, that is not my point. But if it's true that they can produce a vehicle that can go 500,000 miles because it just has less moving parts, that is the ultimate leasing vehicle. If I can put a vehicle out for 10 or 15 full-term leases and only pay for two $6,000 batteries in that process, oh yes please. So, we'll see whether or not that proves out or not, but it's coming and it's a reality. In probably 3 to 4 years, you're going to see EVs at the auction, and there's an opportunity there. Okay, so now, a lot of what I've talked about so far is kind of a comparison between leasing and retail installment sales contract, buy here, pay here. I get a lot of questions from folks that are straight retail dealers saying, man, should I get into leasing or not? And so we put together this basic pro forma. This is very basic, okay? But what we did here is we compared retail sales versus a lease program. Both of them are purchasing the same exact car, $12,000 ACV, selling them for $15,000, or leasing them out for $15,000, putting 30 units on the road per month, and we set their expenses percent of revenue at 11.5% on both of them. Okay, and just ran a real basic pro forma on this. So here we have a P&L comparison and a balance sheet comparison. And what you'll notice up front, and I'm going to read some of these because I know it's really hard to see, is that month 1 and 2, retail absolutely wins, right? Which makes sense because it's driving instant cash flow. When you're creating a leasing portfolio or a buy here, pay here portfolio, you have to build that portfolio before it actually starts kicking off cash, right? So in month 1 and 2, absolutely retail. So let's jump forward into month 13, 14. That is the moment in time when finally the leasing portfolio starts to kick off basically the same amount of cash flow as the retail business. And that took almost a year to get to that point. And because it took a year, and because retail was kicking off more cash flow initially, retail still has $100,000 more equity in their business than the leasing program. So 1 year in, retail still wins. We jump all the way up now to month 18. This is the moment, finally, it takes 18 months for the equity piece to actually flip, where the LHPH program now has generated more equity, built more equity in that business than the retail program. So I always like to joke with anybody and say, you know, if you're intending to be in the car business for 18 months, just stick with retail. But if you want to be in the business a little bit longer than that, then you might consider doing this, because if we go all the way out to 84 months and 7 years down the line, the retail business has built a healthy business. It's $3.2 million in equity. There's nothing to shake a stick at. But the leasing portfolio has now built something that's worth about $13 million. And there's that benefit. And keep in mind, I always like to mention this, you can't see it, but down there it says retail and leasing are not mutually exclusive. It's not that you can only do one or only do the other. Almost all of our dealers do both, right? But this is just purely to illustrate the difference, if you ever are curious. Okay, now I'm going to jump to the depreciation benefit. This is the best visual that I've ever seen for the depreciation benefit. And really what it's showing here is if you got a dealership up on top, $2.5 million in revenue, taxable income at $2.5 million, and they're in a 20% tax bracket, they're going to pay $500,000 in tax that year. That's pretty straightforward. So, if you have a dealer that has a leasing portfolio, and we talked about the depreciation benefits, they have that same $2.5 million in revenue, they have a depreciation expense of $2 million. That means their taxable income is only $500,000. Same tax bracket at 20%. They're going to pay $100,000 in taxes and saves them $400,000 in taxes. That's the power of depreciation. Obviously, I'm not a CPA, and so I certainly would recommend that you talk to your CPA about however that is best set up for you, but it's incredible. You see it with all of our dealers. Oh, and that last little piece that said there is you don't need a related finance company. So with leasing, because you have the tax benefit of depreciation, you don't need the actual discount fee and that transfer between the related finance company and the dealership. So you can actually do it all just as your dealership as the lessor, and the depreciation will just offset the net income of your dealership. So, and I think that's what Bob was alluding to when he said that it's just simpler when you're doing leasing, because you don't have two companies that you have to run, two sets of books, and all that piece. Okay, so I touched on this earlier. Really, these are just two quotes from Epic Bankruptcy Analytics, and both of them are saying that in September they finally saw that trend line of bankruptcies starting to really build. And we fully anticipate that that's going to continue on for quite a long time now. And so the benefit with leasing is that they are considered BK remote. There are only two options with a lease. For your lessee, should they file BK on you, they can either accept the lease, which means that they have to accept the original terms of the lease. There are no cram downs. They cannot shorten it, they cannot extend it, they can't cram down the money factor. They can accept the original terms, or they can reject it and they can give you the car back. Just two options, which makes your life a whole lot easier when you're dealing with BKs, and it's likely we're going to see more of them as we go forward. These three, the collateral control, customer retention, and flexibility, I'm going to kind of merge these ones all together here. I talked about it earlier. You are the lessor of the title. You own the vehicle. It becomes huge in the cases of repossession. In many places, you don't need to do an NOI, notice of intent to sell, after repossession. If you're doing a lease, you don't have the holding period. There's a whole number of items. You always want to check with your local counsel to confirm that your state doesn't have anything unique to leasing, but in most locations, that tends to be the case. With leasing, you are under Reg M, not Reg Z. Reg M is 37 pages long if you print it out, and Reg Z is 317 pages long if you print it out. So if you really prefer less regulatory burden, Reg M is definitely there to help you. Also, of those 37 pages, about half of it is all about how to market and how to advertise a lease payment. Almost half of Reg M is all about how to advertise a lease payment. So if that gives you an idea of how much more flexible Reg M is, there you go. And I've hit this one a number of times, but you can customize your own lease, and you can do all kinds of fun stuff with it. So that's a huge flexibility piece. The additional opportunities to retain your quality customers. If that customer makes it all the way through to the end of the lease, that's probably somebody you would like to put back in your portfolio. And when they bring you that car back, now's your opportunity to figure out a way to convince them to stick with you. This one down here, 5 levers to adjust to make a payment that works for your customer instead of 4. On a retail installment sales contract, you have your sales price, you have your cash down, you have your term, you have your interest rate. Those are your 4 levers. On a lease, you have all those same levers, and then you also have the residual value. So you have a 5th lever to assist you in finding that affordable payment for your customer, which is huge. And as I mentioned before, guaranteed inventory coming back around. Right? Once you have lease returns coming back around, it is a game changer for you. Okay, common questions and misconceptions. This is the #1 question I get, and it's really funny because it comes from like anybody I talk to, no matter what state they're in. It's always the first one I get. What happens if one of my lessees runs into a bus? And what they are referring to is a concept that's called vicarious liability. Vicarious liability was a major issue back prior to 2005 for lessors and rental car companies, which basically was that if one of your drivers got into an accident or hurt somebody, God forbid, killed somebody, you could be sued and be liable for it. So lessors and rental car companies spent a lot of money on excess and contingent liability insurance policies to cover that. And then 2005 comes along, and then President Bush, as part of the transportation bill, signed the Graves Amendment, which actually removed, at a federal level, vicarious liability from lessors and from rental car companies. Since then, we have not seen any successful suits for vicarious liability on any of the lessors, at least that we work with. So, do some of my dealers still carry excess and contingent liability because it helps them sleep better at night, and they want an attorney that will be there in case they get sued for it? We do. We have a handful of dealers that still offer that, but the vast majority of them do not. They allow their retainer to actually cover any suits in that regard, and we've had no successful lawsuits on it. How do I set a residual value? This is a really good question, honestly, right? Because a big piece of the lease is the residual value. So these are guidelines. These are basic guidelines. I know that Bill has some too that he provides in his training class. Basically, we recommend keep your residual value at 20% or greater. What that does is it ensures that your lease is considered an operating lease, which means you get all the tax benefits. If you drop your residual value lower, it starts to look a whole lot like a retail installment sales contract, and you may not cross that threshold for an operating lease, and you may open yourself up to some exposure that a judge might say it's a disguised retail installment sales contract, in which case you can get in big old trouble. So keep your residual value at 20% or above of the agreed upon value. And then these are just our general benchmarks. Go 20 to 25% if your term is going to be 42 to 48, 25 to 35% if you're at 36 to 42, and 35 to 40% if you're at less than 36 months on your term. Now, again, as I mentioned before, our dealers, once they really understand the lease, we've got all kinds of interesting structures on leases. I've got some folks that are at 80% residual values because they pack a whole bunch of products into their money factor in order to get their cash flow back up. There's all kinds of things, but they only go an 18-month lease term. So there's all kinds of different structures you can do, but when you get going, these will work. So now the next question that I get is, well, what about residual risk? Because in new cars, if you can't predict that residual value accurately, you're gonna take a bath, you're gonna get burned. So what's really cool, in used car leasing, dealerships are uniquely positioned to eliminate the residual risk piece. And the reason for that is because when you originate a lease, you're gonna pick a residual value based upon that term. And that customer's gonna go out, and if they make all the payments, at the very end, they're gonna come back to you, and they have two options. If you have a purchase option in your lease, they could either buy it for the residual value, in which case you get all the money, right? Everything that you set your residual value, you get all of it. Or they can give it back to you. And then you recon it, you put it back out on the lot, and you put out another lease. And when you set that next lease, of course the vehicle's depreciated a bit, you reset the residual on the second lease. And that customer drives it. When they get to the end of the lease, they bring it back to you. They either buy it for the residual value, in which case you get paid all the money on it, or they give it back to you and you recon it and you lease it out again and you reset the residual value. Once you've done this 2, 3, 4 times, at some point that last residual value is likely to be somewhere in the ballpark of $1,500 to $2,000. And when you do that, if you miss that last residual value, you're only likely to miss it by a few $100. When that final car comes back in, maybe it's worth $1,200, you set the residual value at $1,500, you lost $300. But that car did 3 full-term leases, and you probably made $30,000 or $40,000 on one car, and missed your residual by $300. So that's why dealers are uniquely positioned to eliminate residual risk on used car leasing. What's the difference between this structure of leasing and lease to own? Really, it boils down to that residual setting being 20% or greater. So that way you get the operating lease piece of both the tax benefits and no risk with there being any sort of disguised retail installment sales contract. That's the primary difference. With lease to own, they make the same payment all the way down to 0, and then the customer owns the vehicle. But that last payment is considered the residual value, and if that payment is similar to the other payments, then it looks a whole lot like a retail installment sales contract, if that makes sense. Bonus depreciation, Bob touched on this a little bit earlier as well. 100% bonus depreciation has been around since 2018. That ends this year. However, 80% is still available next year, 60% in 2024, 40% in 2025. And then after that, you'll be using standard depreciation. And typically, most of our dealers set their depreciation on a straight line 5-year, which means that their depreciation is about 20% a year. So for the next 4 years, you're gonna get an extra boost in depreciation, and then standard depreciation will be the go forward at that point. And as our Buckeye friends like to point out, you can always start to incorporate some reinsurance programs, because you can absolutely put reinsurance products into a lease to consider, or to continue to assist with the tax piece of that puzzle. Okay, so now I did a whole lot of talking about what's different between leasing and buy here, pay here, right? But the reality is, there's a whole lot of things that are the same. So for instance, the sales and leasing process is basically the same. There's that different verbiage that we were talking about, the terminology at the beginning. But outside of that, the actual process is the same process. Underwriting, it's the same customer. You're going to be using the same metrics. You're going to be looking at PTI. You're going to be looking at stability, ability, character, all those same different pieces that you would be on a retail installment sales contract, no different. Your verifications and validations, you're going to get your proof of income, you're going to do your VOEs, you're going to get your POR, you're going to do all the same verifications and validations that you would otherwise, insurance, etc. And your collections processes essentially remain the same. They might get a little bit easier. We talked about the bankruptcy process, we talked about the repossessions, but outside of that, you're still going to be working under the FDCPA, you're still going to be taking your promises to pay, you're still going to be following up, nothing else has changed. And your service department and recon, again, everything is still the same. So I don't want anyone to be like, man, you got to change my whole world if I switch to leasing. That's not the case. Actually, so many of these things are similar, but there are some nuances to leasing. So to finish up here, how do you start your program? I do believe there's a binder that you guys are putting together. We provided some like a little chapter there on how to do used car leasing. It also has a whole bunch of references and places you can go to get more information. Bill Elizondo, right over there, he runs an LHPH training course. He actually just did it last week, I think.
Tuesday.
Tuesday?
Yes.
Man, time flies.
Yes.
All right, so he does provide an LHPH training. He also has a Dealer 20 group for LHPH dealers as well, and he does some consulting. You can reach out to the LHPH compatible DMS systems. Some of them also have consultants, but they can certainly at least get you going and get you all the proper forms and talk about what you need from the DMS perspective. And if you go to our website, www.lhph.com, we have tons of references. We've been doing this for 14 years now, so if you go there, you can find whatever you need when it comes to leasing.